the French and Indian War. All right. We've looked at colonial growth. We saw how the 13 English colonies were established, some for religious reasons, some for economic reasons. Although even those that were established for religious reasons wanted to do well economically. If religious people here coming to America had their way, they'd rather be rich religious than poor religious. So, of course, Georgia had been established as a place for poor people from English jails and as a buffer zone against the Spanish. But those 13 colonies were growing and expanding and prospering economically. New England was busily trading and fishing and lumbering. The middle colonies were basically growing a lot of food, including wheat, and the breadbasket colonies. And down south, the southern colonies, the big moneymaker was tobacco, although certainly in South Carolina, rice and indigo were also very important crops. So all of these items were helping to expand the colonies economically. But during this time, some other European powers had also established colonies in America. To the south was New Spain. So bordering on Georgia was the Spanish colony of, Florida. However, having said that, there weren't many people in Florida, and there weren't many people in Georgia, since Georgia was the last British colony established in the 1730s. And that meant there weren't many opportunities for any interactions, positive or negative interactions. But if you look at the map, you can see New France claimed a large area of land. And that large area of land basically almost surrounded the 13 English colonies. So there was a lot of room for interaction between the British citizens and the French citizens of New France. And those interactions were oftentimes negative interactions because France and England were basically enemies in Europe. Already, France and England had fought 3 times before this war. So in the early 1700s, there was the War of the League of Augsburg, sometimes called King William's War, because King William was on the throne. And it was really called King William's War here in America, basically because the colonists here, they were just getting settled in, the colonies were new, and they thought, why should we have to go fight and maybe die for our king? You know, we're barely struggling to survive here. Now this king, England, has started a war with France, and we're expected to go fight and die for it. So people were more like, stupid King William, stupid war, stupid King William's War. It was more along those lines than an actual naming of King William's War. Same way with the War of Spanish Succession. So over in Europe, the Spanish king had died, and the French wanted their person to be the Spanish king. The British wanted their person to be the Spanish king. And again, there was a war. And again, this time the colonies were involved too, because, again, New France was here in the New World. This time there are a few more people in New France and a few more people in the British colonies. And again, people in the British colonies were, they were busily expanding economically. They were basically building, hoping to build their fortunes, hoping to build their lives. And here comes this war, and now your king expects you to go off and fight and die on this war, even though it probably won't do any good because you're over here in the Americas, and the main action is over in Europe. So again, it was, and by this time, a new monarch had taken the throne, and her name was Queen Anne. And again, in the colonies, it was more like stupid Queen Anne, getting us involved in another stupid war, stupid Queen Anne's War. It's more along those lines. And then comes the War of Austrian Succession, and sometimes called King George's War, from George I, who was King of England at the time. And again, it was more hurled as something as a negative thing here in the colonies, stupid King George getting us involved in another stupid war. We have to fight and die the French. Here, we're just trying to get along and build our colony, and now we have to go fight and die for the king. But nevertheless, some of the colonists did do that for the king and actually invaded what we now know as Canada, because that's where the French were. But eventually the war ends in Europe, which means the war ended in America. So this war is going to start, and this war is under King George II. However, they can't call this war King George's War because there's already been a King George's War. So this war will have a new name, what we call the French and Indian War. And it will be a war fought basically between France and Britain. Now, before the war, the wars between France and Britain had they started in Europe. They started over European things, and then the violence moved to America. Only this time, the violence starts here in America and then moves over to Europe. And that's because both the British and the French claimed land in the Ohio River Valley area, where the Ohio River is, where basically states like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois are today. So both sides claim the same piece of land. And oftentimes in history, where two sides claim the same piece of land, there's going to be a war. And that's especially true because both sides wanted the fur trade. The French and the British both sought out Indians to go into the forest to find furry little animals and kill them and bring them out the furs. And that's because generally if the French person or the British person went into the forest in America, they got lost and they died in the forest. They never came out. So the French and British often use these Indians as agents to go out and find these furry animals and skin them and bring the furs back. And then the French or British would pay the Indians with some type of manufactured item from Europe that the Indians didn't manufacture themselves, like something like an iron knife or maybe an iron hatchet, something like that. And then the British or French would send the furs back to Europe, and they would fetch a very high price indeed. Now, the French were basically really good at doing the fur trade with the Indians because the Indians thought the French were more interested in fur trading than land. So when the French came to trade furs, they basically came to your village, they stayed, they traded things, they left. When the British came to trade, oftentimes they would come, they would stay, they would trade, they would stay, they would take your land, they would kick you off your land. And so most Indians favored the French. Also, French traders tended to marry, or were known to marry, Indian women as well. And so they were sort of intermarried into the tribe. And so most Indians, not all Indians, but most Indians preferred the French, although some Indians, like the Iroquois, preferred the British because the British offered higher prices. So you got more for your furs from the British as far as manufactured items than you would from the French. On the other hand, the British might actually take your land, and the French probably wouldn't. Now, the interesting thing is that one of our more famous Americans, George Washington, helped start this war. Washington was in Virginia. He was a lieutenant in the militia, the part-time army, when the governor of Virginia, Governor Dinwiddie, heard that the French were building a fort on his land, that is land Virginia claimed across the Appalachian Mountains in the Ohio River Valley area. Now, of course, the French thought they were building the fort on their land because they claimed that land too. But nevertheless, Governor Dinwiddie needed someone to go tell the French to get off his land. And certainly the governor was not going to do that because it would take many weeks to go across the mountains and through the forest to get to the French fort to tell them to get out. And certainly the governor was not going to take the chance of dying in the mountains by, making a misstep and falling to his death from a cliff. He was not going to risk drowning in the waters of the rivers. He was not going to risk being eaten by animals in the forest. He was not going to risk getting killed by some Indian. Instead, he was going to send someone to do that. And he just happened to look out his window one day, and there was young George Washington, a young lieutenant, walking by. And the governor motioned him in and said, "Lieutenant, I have a job for you. I want you to go tell the French to get off my land." And so Washington agreed to do that, and he spent the next several weeks traveling across the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio River Valley area to tell the French to get off Governor Dinwiddie's land. When Washington arrived, now generally the French and English didn't get along, but the French fort was out in the wilderness. They hadn't seen many Europeans at all. They'd seen a lot of Indians. So even though this was a British European, at least they were still a European. And perhaps Washington had some news of European affairs. And so the French invited him into the fort, Fort Duquesne, and they had a meal. And during the meal, basically Washington says, "Here's a message from the governor," and handed the French officer a piece of paper. And basically the message read, "Dear French officer, get off my land. Signed, Governor Dinwiddie." So they finished dinner, and the officer, French officer, wrote a reply and said, "Here you go, Mr. Washington. Take that back to your governor." And so again, back through the forest and back through the rivers and back through the mountains went George Washington back to Williamsburg, Virginia, been serving as the capital of Virginia, and gives this paper to the governor. And the governor opens up the paper, and it basically says, "Dear Governor Dinwiddie, no. Signed, your friend the French." And Governor Dinwiddie is really angry. The French told him no. How dare someone tell the governor no? And so the French says, "Washington, gather together some of my militia troops and run those Frenchmen off my land." And so Washington takes a small militia unit, goes across the mountains, goes across the rivers, goes across the forest, and on his way to Fort Duquesne, when one of his scouts comes back and says, "Hey, Washington, they know we're coming. They have a large force in the fort, and they're coming out to kill us." So Washington immediately thinks, "Run away, retreat." So Washington and his militia units start to turn around, they go back towards Virginia. Unfortunately, the French and their Indian allies are quickly approaching, and so George Washington decides, "Hey, we better build a fort or we're going to die out here." So you can see the line where the Washington had come from Virginia, and had gone to Fort Duquesne, and now he's trying to make his way back, but they're not going to make their way back. They're going to be surrounded by the French and die, and so Washington orders a fort to be built. And there's the fort. Fort necessity. It's probably, when I said fort, you're probably thinking something else, but they built the fort in one day. So, what more can you expect in one day? Actually, it's worse than it looks. Because from a distance, the fort's built on low land. And it's not built by water. So when the French arrive, they simply stay on the hills and shoot down into the fort. And basically, it's raining bullets on the British. It's raining bullets on George Washington's men. Even worse, there's no water supply. And so after about a day of being shot at, and no water to drink or to cleanse their weapons with, Washington has to surrender. Now, the French were pretty nice about it. They could have executed George Washington that day, but they didn't. Instead, they said, "Hey, Washington, why don't you go back and tell your governor, this is our land, and, hey, while you're back in Virginia, learn how to build a fort." So Washington goes back and tells the governor, "Hey, governor, we lost, sad." And the governor immediately says, "Hey, that's not fair." And he starts yelling. He's basically yelling, "Hey, help, somebody help me. We're being bullied by the French. Help, mother country, help me." So the governor calls on reinforcements from Britain. And Britain sends over a fine army, about 1,500 redcoats, so-called because they wear red coats, under the command of a general named Bulldog Braddock. And I'm sorry, if your name is Bulldog Braddock, you just have to be really good. And he was. He had won many battles in Europe for the British. And now this guy was supposed to attack the French and drive them out of Fort Duquesne, and the River Valley. And so on the day that the general arrives, there's a planning meeting in Williamsburg. The governor's there, Bullock Braddock's there, some other people are there, George Washington's there, and Bullock Braddock is basically, talking about how he's going to lead the army down the road to Fort Duquesne, and Washington's basically saying, excuse me, General Sir, we don't have a road here. And Bullock, what? You don't have a road? Oh, no road. Stupid colonials don't even have a road. I'll tell you what, Washington, why don't you build me a road to Fort Duquesne? You can be useful to me. Stupid colonials don't even have a road. And so his 1,500 troops start marching down the road to Fort Duquesne as they build the road in the process. Washington is invited to come along with a few of his militia troops to learn from the professionals. They arrive near Fort Duquesne only to walk into an ambush. The French and their Indian allies have learned the British troops are coming, and they set a position in some thick woods, and Bullock Braddock walks right into the ambush, and as the shooting starts, Bullock Braddock races to the scene on his horse, and Bullock Braddock is shot off that horse and shot, and Washington races in. He's basically next in command. He gets on a horse, and his horse is shot out from under him. He gets on a second horse. That horse is shot out from under him. He gets on a third horse. That horse is shot out from him. He has bullet holes in his hat. He has bullet holes in his coat. But fortunately, almost miraculously, there are no bullet holes in George Washington. So Washington gets to lead a second glorious retreat back to Virginia, bringing his military record to 0-2. That's right, our future president starts off his military record with a not so great record at all. So things will not be going very well for the British during this time, because the war in America starts in America but spreads over to Europe. And pretty soon the French and the British are fighting in Europe, and they're fighting basically everywhere they have colonies, which is in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia. It turns into a world war. It's not called a world war. In America, it's called the French and Indian War, because the British are fighting the French and their Indian allies. So the French and Indian War is not a war between the French and the Indians. It's a war between the British versus the French and their Indian friends. So as the war rages, basically England's losing basically everywhere. And of course in America, this loss, 1,500 of the best trained British troops have just been massacred, and many colonials expect the French to come marching in at any moment. So in to the story rides a hero, not Washington, he's 0-2, but Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, the person that sort of represents the colonial people because he's sort of born poor, worked his way up to being rich, and knew a lot about a lot of stuff. He comes up with something called the Albany Plan of Union because he thinks of it in Albany, New York. And they meet in Albany, and he says, hey, the only way to win this war is to all unite. We need all 13 colonies to bring all their supplies together. We need all 13 colonies to bring all their militia troops together. And then we'll have one big super army with really supplied. And with one big super army, we can beat the French and crush them. Otherwise, if we don't join together, we're all going to die. In fact, to illustrate his point, his newspaper publishes the first cartoon in America. And as we'll see, I think I put this in the wrong part, but it's a snake cut into pieces. Let's see what happens next slide. Yes, join or die, he says. Join or die. Unfortunately, apparently, the other colonies would rather die than join. Basically, every colony says, no, we're not going to join with those other colonists. People in South Carolina are saying, what? You want us to join with those religious nuts in Massachusetts, those Puritans? And people in Massachusetts and Connecticut are saying, what? You want us very religious people to join with people in Virginia? They have horse racing down there. They gamble down there. God doesn't like that. And of course, the Protestants are saying, what? You want us to join with those Catholics in Maryland? And the Catholics are saying, what? You want us to join with those Protestants in those other colonies? And so at this stage, basically every colony would rather die than join with the other colonies. and defeat the French. Fortunately, the colonies are going to be saved, but they're not going to be saved by joining together. They're going to be saved by something that happens in England. So the French and their Indian allies were winning the war until a new prime minister, a new leader in England, was elected. And William Pitt, his motto was, "Only I can save England." Now, I don't recommend you adopt that motto, especially if you're in a sports team. I don't think you should, go up to your sports team and say, "Only I can win this game for us." I don't think your teammates would really appreciate that. I don't know if William Penn was the only one who could win the war, only person to get victory, but he did. So when William Penn becomes leader of Britain, he decides on a plan. And the plan is to basically concentrate all British military forces available in America, beat the French in America, and then sort of move that super British Army and Navy to another place. Maybe in Africa and defeat the French there, and then move them to Asia and defeat the French in India, and then move them to Europe and defeat the French there. And eventually the French will be defeated. And that's his plan. So the British war goals, and I say I spelled goals wrong. Actually, that's the way they used to spell a jail in England. But the British war goals were to open the Ohio River Valley up for settlers and to conquer New France. So the British started sending all the reinforcements they had to America. And they started enlisting American militiamen to go with them. Now, one of the problems was that for the British was that the main defense point for the French was Quebec, Canada. Quebec has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Quebec. Remind you of anyone? I don't know. Just wonderful name, Quebec, was vital for the defense of New France. And one reason, if you look at the map, is if you can find Quebec along the St. Lawrence River, if you come up the St. Lawrence River, before you get into the rest of Canada, before you get into the rest of those cities, before you get to the Great Lakes, before you get to the Mississippi River, you have to get past Quebec. And if you don't get past Quebec, you can't get into basically French Canada. Unfortunately for the British, Quebec was built on a very high cliff that overlooked the river. And so cannons, the French cannons, could basically blow any British warships out of the water that tried to sail past Quebec. And that presented a problem. And for a while, for several months, the British commander simply couldn't quite figure out how to attack the French in this fort way up on the hill. He was on the other side of the river, and obviously, if you try to get over in the daylight, where they blast him, and he couldn't bring his warships in, or they blast those too. Besides, how do you climb the cliff? I mean, but then one day he's looking through his binoculars, and he sees a goat down at the beach area, and doesn't have anything else to do, so he watches the goat. And as he watches the goat disappears for a moment, and then he notices the goat sort of moving up the cliff. There's a little trail, a goat trail that goes up the cliff all the way up to the very top of the cliff. And so the British commander says, that's it. We'll climb the goat path, and we'll have an army behind Quebec, and the French will have to come out and fight, and we'll win. Of course, first of all, a goat path is only really big enough for a goat, which basically means it's only a couple of feet wide, and it's rugged. And the British commander says, we're going to do this at night. We don't want our surprise known. We don't want the French to know we're coming. So the British basically row boatloads of men across the water during the night. And then, without lights, because lights would have been seen, they start to go up the goat path. And by the next morning, they have an army outside of Quebec. The French are forced to come out and fight. During that fight, both the French and the British commander are wounded. But the British commander lives long enough to see his men enter Quebec. And once Quebec falls, the rest of Canada is going to fall as well. So Quebec was vital for the defense of New France, but was captured by the British. And once it was captured by the British then moved into the rest of Canada and then started completing the rest of their war plans, because after they basically defeated New France in America, they started moving their sort of super army around the world and would defeat France. So New France was taken over by the British. The colonists won. The British won. New France was, if you look at the picture here, on my right-hand side, I don't know about you, but the map with the yellow, the map with the orange is New France. The map to the next of it with only purple and green, that's after the French and Indian War. So notice what happens to the orange. It goes away. That's what happened to New France. It went away. In fact, the only New France left were two little islands off the Canadian coast. They're still there today, and they're still French territory today. But that was it. The rest of New France was gone. And in 1763, France and Britain signed a treaty called the Treaty of Paris 1763. It ends the war. And at the end of this war, New France is British, and part of New France falls to the British as well. That is, all the area in the red becomes British. The Spanish, who've been fighting with the French in Europe, for their trouble, the French actually gave them the other part of New France, which had been on the other side of the Mississippi River. So Spain, as you know from your Texas history course, had a claimed area up through Texas, but now they had more land all the way to the Mississippi River. So after the French and Indian War, the boundary line, the Mississippi River served as the boundary line between the British colonies and the Spanish colonies. Unfortunately, the French and Indian War would lead to another war. At the end of the French and Indian War, when the British took control of the French forts in the Ohio River Valley area, the French left, the British walked in. The Indians were very displeased. The Indians had been fighting with the French, and now the French says, "Oh, we're going home. We lost. Bye. See ya." And the British, the people they didn't like, were moving into those forts. And one of the first things, of course, the British did was perhaps to start taking over Indian land. They started bringing settlers in, and those settlers started taking Indian land. Naturally, that angered the Indians, and the Indians went on the warpath, so to speak, in what's called Pontiac's Rebellion. So the Indians started attacking British forts that had been French, all in the Mississippi Valley area. They started killing civilians, and the British were forced to respond. They sent in the army troops. After about 6 months, the Indians realized the French were not coming back. No matter what the Indians did, the French were never coming back. And so the Indians realized they would just sort of have to get along with the English, and they stopped attacking the English. And that sort of ends the rebellion. But the war, this Pontiac's Rebellion, had cost the English money. They had to send in more troops. And this is just after they fought a world war against the French. And wars cost money. Big wars cost a lot of money. World wars cost an astronomical amount of money. So Britain was already deeply in debt from the war with France. And now they had to shell out more money for this Indian uprising. So the last thing they wanted was another Indian uprising. They simply couldn't afford it. So the way they thought about stopping the Indians from rising up is, hey, if the Indians don't like settlers settling on their lands, simple, we'll just stop the settlers from settling on their land. That is, we'll tell the settlers to not go on Indian lands. Specifically, we'll tell the settlers to stay on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains. We'll tell them to stay on the sides that they started colonizing, where the Virginia and Massachusetts are. We'll tell them not to cross the mountains into the Indian Territory. And that will prevent a war. So if you see the picture here, you see a very dark shaded red, and then you see sort of a light shaded red, and that is basically the Appalachian Mountains. And the Appalachian Mountains would serve as a boundary. And the British citizens would stay on the eastern side, the Indians would stay on the western side, and there'd be no more fighting, and everyone would be happy. Well, not everyone. The settlers who were thinking, hey, look at all that land we could have, are now being told, sorry, can't have that land. That might anger the Indians. They're not going to be happy. And because the war had cost Britain so much money, and Britain had fought part of that war to defend the colonies, Britain decides, hey, maybe we should tax those colonists to help pay for the war. And that will really anger colonists. Nothing like raising taxes to anger people. Never has been popular here in America, and probably never will be. So we'll see later exactly how this anger will boil over into the American Revolutionary War. So the end of one war would lead to the start of another war.